as I welcome our next four marvelous speakers. I welcome up Mother Clare, Community Servant Superior of the Franciscan Sisters of the Renewal. Come on up, Mother Clare. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Thank you. I would like to welcome up Father Michael, Vocation Promoter with the Jesuits. Woohoo! Sorry. U.S. Midwest Province. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to welcome up Brian Rhude, Project Coordinator, Catholic Apostolate Center. What? Whoop, whoop. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here with us. And I'd like to welcome up Beth Knobbe, Relationship Manager, Catholic Relief Services. Welcome. Round of applause. Welcome. Thank you for your time. And we are going to leave it up to each one of you to engage us with your conversation today.
Because my name was printed first, I got designated first. I wasn't here this morning, and so I've missed the first portion of this, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm really glad to be here. It's a privilege to share this time with you, and just have very brief thoughts to share now, and looking forward to the part where we can just talk about things together, which is what this is all about. But I come from New York. I just moved to East Harlem from the Bronx, and I, even though I am the community servant for our community newly for 1 year, I do young adult ministry there in New York. And in fact, when I became the community servant, I begged the sisters to let me keep doing it. And to my surprise, they have allowed me to continue that ministry. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful opportunity to accompany young adults in New York City with their spiritual lives, and from that, with their discernment. And so just what I'd like to share is what I see as being so central, and I saw it shining through in little portions of the document, the need for silence, the need for prayer, the need for contemplative development to be able to discern well, and how we can't really take anything for granted. And I saw that in the document as well, the understanding that the Holy Father has, that we first, each one of us, need to get in touch with God's profound and personal and intimate love for us. And I've seen that I can't take for granted that the young adults in my ministry have that concretely. That they may know that, but do they have that sense, that knowledge, that conviction that they're deeply, deeply loved? And does their prayer life and then everything else flow from that relationship, and especially in including the discernment? And so I think what I've seen with discernment and vocational work is that that's really the starting point. That it's, if I want to know what my parents want me to do, well, I don't even need to ask. They've been telling me my whole life. Or I go home and I sit down around the coffee table and I hear about their plans, but I need to go into prayer to know about God's plans. So developing the life of prayer, helping others develop their life of prayer, and in particular through silence, through Lectio Divina, focus on the Word of God, and Eucharistic adoration. And so the young adult ministry that I'm particularly involved in, you may be familiar with it, you may do it yourself, the Samuel Group Program, which was created by Cardinal Martini out of Milan, Italy, and brought to the United States by the Apostles of the Interior Life. And we brought it to New York and have been doing it there with young adults for the past 4 years. And that's the focus, really. It's not so much on the end. It is, but it isn't. The end of marriage or religious life or priesthood or lay vocation or whatever the call is. But the focus is on the individual's intimate, personal relationship with God in prayer, and how everything else flows out of that. So we've been focusing on developing that, how to develop and how to accompany. So when the Holy Father speaks of silence, that's what touched me very deeply, and I think is a great starting point as for my own self and my own ongoing discernment of what he's asking of me moment by moment, day by day, year by year, but then also in helping others get in touch with that. And because he just kind of out of the blue, he stops right in paragraph 115 and he says, try to keep still for a moment and let yourself feel his love. And I was on the plane, like reading over this again. Like, what am I going to say? And that line, and I stopped there on the plane, and between two people, let me stop and try to keep still for a moment and let myself feel his love. That's where discernment comes from. That's where it all rises out of that. Try to keep silence is his next line. Try to silence all the noise within and rest for a second in his loving embrace. So cultivating the ability to do that in our hectic, frantic world, cultivating that in ourselves and helping to cultivate it in those we work with, I think is very, very key to going forward with discernment and vocational ministry. So I'll stop with that thought.
Thank you, Mother Clare. As was said, my name is Father Michael Rossmann. I'm a Jesuit from the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa, but I live just about 5 miles north of here in Chicago. I want to focus on paragraph 295, in which the Holy Father talks about how good discernment is a path of freedom. So I absolutely agree with just the necessity for silence, for prayer. I think his talking about freedom is also crucial for good discernment. In another address, Pope Francis talks about how work for vocations has to be about attraction and not proselytism. In many documents, both Pope Benedict, Pope Francis talk about the need to propose rather than impose. In the Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis talks about how there is a dearth of vocations when there's a lack of fervor, but vocations will flourish, and I'd say vocations to priestly and religious life, likewise to committed married life, and likewise to committed single life, when there is, quote, contagious apostolic fervor. Contagious apostolic fervor. That if we have the fervor and we allow for the freedom, vocations will flourish. I have to admit, though, in my current work of vocation promotion for the Jesuits, I hear lots of stories from guys about their experience with other religious orders or their dioceses and so forth. And sometimes I have to be honest, I hear stories that don't always illustrate that freedom. Just 2 weeks ago, I was talking with a young man he's in his 20s now, but when he was coming out of high school, he was at least considering the minor seminary, and the vocation director, at least according to this young man's telling of the account, seemed to be pretty heavy-handed, and it was a little bit more than the proposition. At least from his telling, it seemed to be a little bit more of an imposition. And finally, the mother of this young man just said, "No, I've never seen my son so miserable," because that imposition seemed to be pretty strong. That freedom that Pope Francis talks about is so essential. A Jesuit teammate and I, also involved in this work, we talk about how ours is the work of information and not sales. Now, you have to admit, though, I make that information widely known, and I absolutely propose. We have to allow people to have the freedom to really say yes. Something else I hear at times, and I have to admit it makes me a little uneasy as well, is that sometimes I'll hear people say, well, it's not about what I want, it's what God wants. And I want to say, yes, but let's nuance that a little bit. Because I deeply believe that our vocation is not alienating to who we are. That God has knitted us in our mother's womb, and that our vocation, rather than being alienating, is inevitably going to be in sync with who we are at our deepest, best, holiest selves. The vocation intersects with our gifts and passions. God wants us to thrive. Not just survive, but God wants us to thrive in whatever vocation that might be. When young men or young women or people of any age are discerning a vocation, it's not a matter of just looking at a piece of paper at the different vocations and doing kind of a cold analysis of what is objectively the best way of serving God and God's people. It has to resonate with who we are created by our loving Creator. God dwells within our deep desires. Now, of course, as sinners, we can desire all sorts of things that are not good for us. But in terms of our deepest, holiest desires, I think that's a significant way that God communicates with us. I believe that God wants us to be our best selves, ultimately for his greater glory and the service of God's people.
They asked us to pick our quotes. And I found my quote, and it was great. But even up until, 6 minutes ago when we were sitting in the back. Which mic? Does this work? There we go. Even from just a few minutes ago when we were sitting in the back, I was kind of like, man, this quote, not really sure what I'm supposed to do with it. I picked it, I got to stick to it. And then, but just earlier, I was scrolling through Twitter during lunch, and where all good ideas come from. And I saw the Holy Father, obviously it's Wednesday, so they had the Wednesday audience, and he said this: the Holy Spirit gives believers courage. Just look at the apostles, who ran when Jesus was arrested. But once the Spirit came upon them, they were courageous witnesses of the gospel. And it took the quote that I had picked and kind of gave it new meaning. So I looked at paragraph 168 from Christus Phoebe. And the Holy Father says that young people forget that the lay vocation is directed above all to charity within, 1, the family, 2, social charity, and 3, political charity. And he continues to combine those 3 things, the family, social, and political charity, into this phrase that these all add together to the building of a new society. What does that mean, though? Who do we have to be to build this new society? It means that we have to be forming missionary disciples. I don't think there's any question about that. So where does it come in with what the Holy Father said? That requires courage. Because we can look at what we've done in ministry for decades. And I think any person here would say there's a lot of things that have worked. There's been a lot of good. We've seen vocations. Right? But there's a lot that hasn't worked. So the courage that the Holy Father is talking about, that comes only from the Holy Spirit, we don't get it from ourselves. That courage is to make us look and see, how are we forming missionary disciples? How do we look at this vocation? The Holy Father speaks about it as the lay vocation. But in the end, what's he talking about? This charity, serving others, specifically in the family, but he's also talking about the political sphere, the social sphere. It's the universal call to holiness. That whether you are an ordained person, you're in consecrated religious life, you're married, we're all called to. So that, for me, and Tracy and Simone, how can I forget? That's embarrassing. She's been making me laugh this whole time. Our wonderful MC has asked us to kind of create questions that we're going to leave you guys with. So I guess that's really my thought. How do we take what the Holy Father is saying about vocation, that we all share, this lay vocation, this vocation to religious life that is fueled by the universal call to holiness? That if that does not exist, that if we're not striving for holiness, which Archbishop Chaput from Philadelphia just said in an address a few days ago, right? Holiness isn't niceness. It's not being good. Generally, holy people are good. Sometimes they're nice. But that's not what holiness is. How are we, in young adult ministry, being courageous to form missionary disciples, to form people to holiness, and to form ourselves to holiness, because we can't give from what we don't have? And where does that lead to good, spirit-filled marriages? Where does that lead to religious vocations? How are we being courageous in forming missionary disciples as our vocation that we all share to holiness?
Good afternoon. My name is Beth Knobbe. I'm the author of this little book called Party of One, Living Single with Faith, Purpose, and Passion. really grateful to be part of a panel talking about vocations and being able to reflect on my own vocation and call to the single life, and having a chance to write and speak and live into my own call, which has led me into service with Catholic Relief Services. I want to share a little anecdote about a really pivotal moment in coming to embrace my own call, and especially the call to the single life. A very wise priest had said to me one time, one of the deepest emotions I would encourage you to sit with in your discernment is what makes you angry. He said, anger is one of those things that we often fear, that we often push aside and push down. But anger is important because anger brings clarity to the things that we value. We get angry when the things we truly care about are threatened, whether that's losing a heated argument or the fear of losing a close friend. We get angry in our attempts to save face or save our pride, when we stand up for what we believe in, stand up in the face of injustice. Anger exposes ourselves, makes us vulnerable in front of another person or for a particular cause. When we allow ourselves to be angry in the presence of God, God will reveal God's desires for us, because it's God alone who truly knows the source of that anger. I remembered that little bit of advice one night after attending the wedding of some really great friends of mine. It was a beautiful wedding, kind of wedding that I hope all of you have had a chance to experience, where you know this couple is just made for one another. The thing that made me really angry that night was that that wedding was not mine. And it was becoming more and more clear to me that married life was not God's desire for me. And I remember coming home back to my apartment and literally taking off my high heels and my party purse and throwing them across the apartment and flopping myself down on the bed and looking up to heaven and saying, WTF, really? Really? But again, in one of those moments that I think we've all experienced in our call, I found myself taking a deep breath and a deep sigh and hearing God say, Beth, I know you're angry, but I still love you, and I'm not going to stop loving you. So let's keep talking about this. And within a year, I had started graduate school here at CTU studying ministry. I gave up dating, not out of anger or resentment or hurtfulness, but out of this sense of freedom and realization that by putting my hopes for some other kind of relationship on hold, God was opening up relationships in my family, in ministry, and with friends that I never imagined possible. And it's really through the fruits of those relationships and through the fruits of ministry that I have lived into this call of being a single woman, a single layperson in the church. The quote from Christus Vivit that really stood out to me in rereading it again this week is paragraph 162, where the Holy Father says, I would like to remind you that you won't become holy and find fulfillment by copying others. Imitating the saints does not mean copying their lifestyle and their way of living holiness. You have to discover who you are and develop your own way of being holy, whatever others may think or say. Becoming a saint means becoming more fully yourself, becoming what the Lord wished to dream and to create, and not a photocopy. Your life ought to be a prophetic stimulus to others and leave a mark on the world, the unique mark that only you can leave. Whereas if you simply copy someone else, you will deprive this earth and heaven too of something that no one else can offer. It echoes the words of Thomas Merton, who once said, "Many poets are not poets for the same reason that many religious are not saints. They never succeed in being truly themselves." For me, the single life sometimes feels very countercultural, but it can be a vocation when it is lived in freedom in service of the kingdom. And I'm also reminded of that great little line from Mother Teresa when she says, God has not called us to be successful, God has called us to be faithful. And I think that's what I also hear each of us talking about, is how do we invite young adults to be faithful to this call? How do we give them the tools and resources that they need to be faithful to where God is calling them, regardless of what it looks like, and especially if it looks different than some of the role models that they've been given? How do we accompany them in ways that their own prayer and their own desires lead them on this path of holiness in goodness for the kingdom? Thanks.
Wow. I like the way I just blend into the background and Tracy goes up there and she's my voice, right? She likes.
What was that, Timon?
Yeah, I said I like the way I'm blending into the background, and Tracy is like my front person.
That was beautiful. There was so many. I've got all these mics. I don't know what to do right now. There were so many connections to be made up here. I don't want to make them for anyone else, but there was certainly, that conversation about this one's a busted one.
Busted. Yellow is busted. Yellow is busted. Yellow is busted.
Just that whole idea of, especially Beth, what you were honing in on towards the end there, and Father, and all three of you had so many connections to one another. But that idea, Father, that our vocation is not alienating who we are, and then Beth, you just said, to bring yourselves in silence to conversation with God, not copying others, but developing your own way of being holy. And so that connection throughout. And then I'm also hearing that analysis paralysis we talked about this morning, but then finding that silence. And so we have some questions that you have all posed to the rest of us, and you're welcome to continue to allow us to grapple with that. But if you would like, I can throw a few of those out to the rest of us. What I'd like to do is have us kind of just sit on a lot of this and really think about it. What does everything we just heard today and this afternoon just now, what does this mean? And so, Brian, you had asked, how do we take what Pope Francis is saying about vocation, that courage that comes from the Holy Spirit, to make us look at how we're forming missionary disciples? How do we take that? What are we doing with that? Does anybody have, we want to draw from the wisdom from the room in terms of activities that you've been seeing, drawing light from, that are really encouraging, questions that you have for the rest of our panelists. This is a wide open discussion for us to share the wisdom of the room and the wisdom of our panelists. So I want to invite all of you, maybe just starting with what Brian, and do you want to rephrase it, Brian? Please do if you'd like. Did I say it well? I can't read my handwriting.
Yeah, no, I think that was good. I think something I saw when I look back on my notes that goes along with that, though, is I think in a lot of ways, the point I was making about how we've done ministry over the past however many decades, one thing that I think the courage gives us is the opportunity to be uncomfortable. The courage that comes from the Holy Spirit allows us to take on those things that make us uncomfortable. So the ways we've been doing ministry that we're comfortable with, is that comfort that God is drawing us into, or is it comfort that we're clinging to because we're afraid to go somewhere else? So as we're looking at, how are we forming missionary disciples, whether that, again, is faithful marriages or is religious vocations, are we being courageous in our ministry to young people? Are we allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable, or are we clinging to something that isn't the rock that we've been assured is what will keep us grounded and keep us and get us to heaven?
Thoughts on that from everyone? Is there anything we're clinging to? Anything anybody's wrestling with about that comfort level?
Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm in the Diocese of St. Petersburg in Florida, and I'm in charge of a kind of more of a regional youth ministry with my parish. And just working in young adult ministry over the last couple of years, and this question of discernment, and also being in the last session where we talked about a lot about discernment and like the common misconceptions that we're like, we have to be in this vocation, like this pressure to find a vocation. It just has me thinking as a young adult minister, like a lot of young adults come to our young adult gatherings because they're interested in other people. Like it's just a reality that I face. But like it's gotten me thinking of like, what is the purpose of my young adult ministry, and is this a good thing? It's fulfilling this, like, because one of the things that really stuck out to me in the last session was discernment has to be found in community. And this might be the only source of community that these young adults have to find, like, to talk to other Catholic people, in a sense. So, like, I guess my question is, like, where is the happy middle ground of, like, not just having, like, a total just single Catholic group that, like, is just everybody's dating each other versus, like, how actually doing young adult ministry of, like, helping them realize their primary vocation to holiness. How do you do both well, I guess is my question.
Is your question for the panel or for the room?
For the panel. Panel.
Dang, I tried to make y'all answer that in the room. I was trying to save you all. Did you see how I did? I was like, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to toss that out to the room. That made us uncomfortable, so.
It was a good one, though. Nobody wants to tackle that one, huh? Seriously?
Timon, I'll take a try at that one. You know, when I think about young adult ministry, and I hope this was part of your conversations earlier today as well, you know, is it programmatic or is it relational? And if it's relational, is it grounded in a relationship with Christ, or is it grounded in a relationship with one another? And that's not to say that, you know, we don't find Christ in the presence of Christ and God's call in and with community, but we do. But I think it's where is the emphasis? And then also thinking programmatically, you know, is this a social club or a spiritual club? So again, it's like thinking about those pillars. You know, what are the pillars of your ministry that create opportunity for a relationship centered in our call to holiness, whether that's retreats or liturgy or spiritual direction, small faith sharing communities. What are those pillars that when people, especially people who are new, maybe people who come in thinking like, just want to find a good hookup this weekend, like I just hope I have a date on Saturday night, that they immediately get the sense that like, oh, this is different. This is not the same as my girls' night out book club. You know, this isn't guys getting together to play football on the weekend or soccer on Saturday morning. There's something different here. So I guess my thought is, you know, what are you inviting people into, and how are you inviting it and structuring it in a way that clearly it's about a different kind of relationship, a different way of being in community, both through the kinds of relationships that it fosters, but also through what those programmatic pillars are.
So you go in their door and go out yours. You know that, and ultimately we want to lead them to the door of holiness. But I mean, most people are called by God to the married life, and so that desire of wanting to find someone is not a bad thing. And we can use that to create spaces where we can find authentic community, but then we're also, you know, using that same environment that you help cultivate ultimately, you know, towards holiness, as you're talking about.
Anybody else weighing in? No. Okay, that's a different question.
I was going to say, does anybody have like any way that they've also struggled with that idea of like we have all of this fellowship, but also do we have, you know, the spiritual formation, you know, and things like that? Is anybody else struggling with that? Has anybody had any connections they've made in their own ministries to kind of bridge that gap? Remember, say your name and where you're from.
Thank you for saying.
Sean Allen, Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Right now I work for the diocese. I used to also work for a parish reaching out to young adults. I think one of the things is we have what we tend to call it come and see type activities that are drawing a wide variety of people. You know, a lot of theology on taps operate this way. So yeah, you will get people coming for the talk. You also get people coming, the shorter the talk, the better. They're there to meet the other people, and you end up kind of getting a feel for where everyone is. But kind of the concept behind come and see is that it's not just a come event, it's a come and see. And so how do you, and it's not just like the programming or what type of group you are, but the idea is that they're coming to see disciples in a community of disciples. So that they say, like, oh, there's something different about these people. There's something different going on here. Like, there has to be something different about it, or it's just another social, it could be at any bar, whether theology on tap is going on or not. So the struggle is having a critical mass of disciples, people following the Lord with their lives, so that when people come, and doesn't matter what reason they're coming, but they're coming and they see, and they start asking the questions. Like, I'm curious, like, see Jesus, and he's like, come and see, and with the idea they're going to come and see, and they're going to want to know more. There's something after that, something to follow up. So it's also having the invitation to any type of those activities. What is the invitation you're going to be issuing to those people who come? They're only looking for a spouse. I mean, there's people who are coming for the talk and also looking for a spouse, right? They're not mutually exclusive. But if that's the only reason that they came, great, that's their door. But what's the invitation that's going to be issued afterwards? So hopefully it's the environment that they experience such that there's something different that they'll accept that next invitation. So I think the struggle is, all right, we have the parish says that we had ultimate frisbee, right? Yeah, people can come and play, but there weren't a whole lot of disciples there, so it wasn't that different than going and playing ultimate frisbee with any other group playing ultimate frisbee, right? So the struggle is having those, but also having enough disciples there to make it different.
I'm Katie Gramke. I'm in Atlantic, Florida, Orlando, Florida area, at a parish. And as a concrete example, we for many, many years had a young adult group that was very much like a social group that was on Friday nights. So the kind of people that don't have very good community and or social skills, which is okay. But the problem was it was a very much like a social oriented group, not a lot of spirituality, and it was a come and see and hang out, but then they weren't very welcoming either. So we had this very painful, transition, because we were running into more and more young adults that were like, okay, we want community, we want formation, we want all these things that this group is not offering, so what does this transition look like? And so what we ended up doing was we kind of formed like a side, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it, but we ended up forming men's and women's groups to have intentional formation time with one another to build community, but to have that intentional formation time and doing book readings together and having a discussion on a spiritual level. And then it kind of transitioned into the other group and trying to join together. And so now we have more events. So, but I think it's the good old Catholic both and. We have to have social events that draw people in that are like, oh, maybe I'll meet someone and they'll show up, but also that foundation of like, okay, this community is more than a social event. This community is faith-based, spirituality-based, and again, like good old Catholic both and. We have to have like all these different components. Something that I will say that is a struggle is we do now have a lot of good, deep community that's starting to form. But people actually aren't dating each other, which is very interesting to me. Everyone's like, we're waiting around for a spouse, but we refuse to date each other, which is very interesting. And I think that we're looking at, again, like people are starting to dive in spiritually and having good community, but also like the look at, like, are you doing everything in your power to chase that universal call to holiness in addition to like vocation, big B vocation too, so. I ramble.
At the university that I still attend. We do, we call them Friday night events. It's not a very creative name. But we do, and before I got there, from what I understand, these events didn't start till 8-ish, and the goal, and they're directed specifically at college freshmen, but anyone in the university community can go. But the goal, I think originally, in part at least, was to keep our students from just going and getting trashed, right? If the events run long enough, they'll be tired, they won't want to go to the parties, and then we lose that issue. We've moved them up earlier and earlier, that now sometimes they start at like 5 p.m. and they're ending at 8. So we're really just kind of giving them a pregame without alcohol sometimes, right? And I mean, it sounds awful, but it's true. And when I was doing that ministry, it took me a while to realize, but it finally hit. And some of my community members, we had the same thing too. The events aren't necessarily the problem. It's the focus on the events as events that is the problem. We need to turn that to seeing through a lens of encounter. The event is not an issue in the essence of event. I'm in metaphysics right now, so, give me a break. But if we don't see our events as a method of encounter with the risen Lord, then they will fall short. So sometimes for us in that ministry, when we were dealing with these high school freshmen or sophomores and juniors who are young adults, sometimes, we're going to go to the trampoline park. We don't have to have mass on the trampolines, but are we doing something as minimal as opening and closing in prayer? How are we helping others to encounter the Lord? For us, if we're on a bus or on the metro going to the Nationals game, are we all huddled together as the ministry cohort? And I'm sure many of you have teams at your parish or in your diocese that you work with. So at events, are we all standing to the side, kind of just talking with one another, and having those that we're ministering to just standing out as other? Or is that a method of encounter with the Lord? So I think events can get a bad rap, and I can do that myself sometimes too when I get a head of steam going and start talking about events. But an event, when viewed through the lens of encounter with the Lord, the encounter that Pope Benedict XVI talks about in Deus Caritas Est, right? That encounter that creates this sense of belonging in the Christian community, that changes life and gives it its decisive direction, then our events kind of take on new meaning, and they can be social, right? Social events aren't bad, but are we just putting on Catholic dating on Friday nights, and that's our only goal? Or is it, we're going to be social, we're going to help see each other as Christ, and then maybe our next event is more forward, maybe it's a theology on tap, or maybe it's a talk on the liturgy or something like that. But that's how I've come to see it, is are the events that I'm planning, are they first viewed through and continued throughout the process of planning and execution as an encounter with Christ, or is that on the back burner?
We have a question from online.
Adam from the Archdiocese of Mobile had a very good question to the panel from earlier. When we were talking about silence, the question is, how do we cultivate silence for millennial and Gen Z young adults who are often immersed in the noise of the world? And how can we help them discern the voice of God in their prayer life among the other voices in their heads and in their hearts?
That's a fabulous question. And there's not an easy answer, I don't think, because it's not a just once and done sort of fervorino that you can give, or a little tack on a prayer at the end of something that fills that need, that answers that question. So they're really, in our archdiocese, the Archdiocese of New York, it's big enough that you can run all kinds of different events with different ends and have people for them all. So you can do things that are strictly social, and that's your purpose, that's your goal, and you're not disappointed if that's all that it is. And you can also do a very deep formation program that has that as its goal. And if any socialization happens, it's just a side fringe benefit, And that's what the program that I do is, and people that sign up for it know that going in, that if you happen to meet each other and like each other, well, that's just a great, an extracurricular fringe benefit of being part of it. But this is an 8-month serious spiritual formation that's going to help you, if you lean into it, to learn the discipline of silence and learn the discipline of discernment and prayer, which there is a discipline involved, and like learning anything, a language or an instrument, we have to invest in it. And so I think we have to get that idea across to young people, because we can talk about holiness or prayer, but it's not so instantaneously achieved. It has to be cultivated in our lives. So it's a great question. So for us, we say, well, let's take 8 months and work at it. Let's take 8 months and work at that. And so we start in September, and even leading up to the first meeting, we're in touch, through emails and through videos and encouraging. All right, now think about what your daily prayer is like. Think about what your routine. Bring your prayer to prayer. What are your goals in prayer? What does God want for you? What's realistic for the type of hours that you work, and the family that you have, and the place that you live, and the commute that you have? And so we start there. And can you add some silence into that, or does it all have to be agenda-driven prayer? My rosary, my chaplet, my novena, my this. So you know what I mean. So we cultivate. Okay, this is what you're doing. This is what you feel God might want you to do. Is there silence? Now can we? And then so part of it is that giving yourself a long runway to work at a thing and not think it's going to be quickly accomplished. The other thing is to get some one-on-one accompaniment. So we'll have 60 people in this 8-month program, but they each get a spiritual director that's going to sit down and invest in them on a monthly basis and hear out, well, they're talking about silence, but this is what happens to me when I try to be silent. So you have someone who can, work with you on a very, very individual basis. That's essential too, because we're unique, we're individual, we bring our own temperament to our life of prayer, we bring our own distractions to our life of prayer. So we need someone that's going to help us, work through that. So the time commitment, the individuality of it, and then the very sort of thought out approach of looking at, well, what are those distractions, and does that have to do with attachments and maybe things that need to be let go of? And to be able to, so we look very systematically, starting with trusting God. What's your image of God? Do you trust in God? Do you know him? The self-knowledge of where do I come from? What are the past things, wounds, or whatever that may be holding me back from advancing in prayer? And what are my attachments? So we sort of progress through those topics before we ever even utter the word vocation or even discernment. All of that is just groundwork to going there. So it's a long answer to a short question, but that's because it's not simple, but it is possible. It is possible.
There's also a great Catholic app called Hallow, and Alessandro can tell you all about it. But it actually is a wonderful tool for walking you through slowly more quiet, contemplative Catholic prayer. Check it out.
I think the other piece of that coming out of silence is that question about listening and how do we listen for what is truly the voice of God and what is not the voice of God. I think being really attentive to the things that bring us joy, and not the joy that is fleeting, but that joy that is deep and grounding and affirming, that deep yes, even a yes in front of something that might bring up fear, the appropriate kind of fear and anxiety, and I think also watching for the kind of fruits of prayer that are sometimes unimaginable. And I think about a friend of mine who I've been walking with right now, who's doing a lot of discernment, a young adult, just finished a master's degree, and is like looking for the next career move that just feels like he's hitting a wall and a wall and a wall. And he said, but Beth, I just keep going back to my prayer, and there's this sense that this is where I'm supposed to be. And he's like, I don't like it. It's messy, and I don't have a deep sense of clarity. He's like, but I don't doubt that God has invited me to all of these different places in my life, including work in ministry and social justice. And he said, and now I'm at this new place, and he said, I feel something happening, but I'm waiting for that sense of joy and that sense of clarity and that decision to say yes. And I remember saying to him, God will not be outdone in generosity. And a door had closed, a career option had closed for him. And I said, God will not be outdone in generosity. And to continue to sit in that silence and sit in that trust of God has good things in store for you. but being patient, waiting. And I think for us as ministers, that means waiting with and continuing to encourage, because we've all been there.
So I'm sorry, can I ask my question and then I'll come to you in a minute? I think we may have time. I'm going to make time. If all of the young adults who are in a leadership role, would you stand? Yeah, young adults in a leadership, by age. Young adults who are in a leadership role, right? Okay, this is an awesome ass room. Don't sit down. What's up with you? All of a sudden, people start sitting down. What was that all about? What is Timon getting ready to do? So my question to you all is, what is vocation and discernment to you? And then how are you sharing that in whatever leadership role you're in? So that's the question to you. And if you could just spend some time at the tables where you are, because you are represented at every table here. Yep, that one's a little lacking, so you might want to join another table and lead them by themselves. I don't know, just lead them by themselves. Just go to another table. They got two? And if you all could kind of spend some time on that, because you've done some vocation work and some discernment stuff. So if you could spend the last few minutes that we have in that dialogue at your table as young adults doing that. Yes, please, because somebody took notes for me. Who was taking notes while I was formulating that question? That's what you wrote? Mike, in the mic. Yeah.
Is it on? We had that one working. So what I wrote down is, so you have all been called as young adults to this leadership position. What is vocation to you? Kind of like, what is your journey? How did you discern God's call?
And as leaders, how are you then sharing that with
that story? In your story.
In
right?
your work.
Right, yeah. So how are you called, and how can you share that story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Seems as if there's been some vibrant conversation. We hope to hear
did I just turn my mic
little bit
on?
of
Okay,
the
so
fruit.
thank you all so very much for entering into this particular activity. And I realize that I'm cutting short your conversation right about now.
Great. So what was the fruit of the conversation? How do you put some of this stuff into practice in your own life and as leaders, as Timon led us into our conversation and talking about? Or we can just awkwardly stare at each other.
Or we'll start calling on you. Sarah.
Is it on? So one of the things that I heard at my table is the outside influence. Like, the conversations are happening, and when somebody comes to us and says that they have a calling to religious life, how do we respond? How do families respond? How do friends respond? And there seems to be a disconnect in what the appropriate manner is. Like, oh, you shouldn't do that, or have you thought about, and have you dated around, and what is the right thing to say? And no, you don't ask, have you dated around? We don't do that. That's not a thing that we would do. I get that, but there's an underlying. But that is underlying. I mean, that's a joke line, but that is underlying, especially from parents.
Have you checked out what the world has to say? Have you seen what the world has available for you? Have you seen where God might else be calling you? You know, so what are the resources and tools for families and friends to be able to support somebody that comes to them and shares this intimate calling with them and says, I am being called by God to the singlehood, to being single for the rest of my life. I am being called to this specific. And so that's kind of what I heard here. And when talking to some of the people in my home Vocations office, gosh, probably about a year ago, one of the things that I heard was the biggest stumbling block is parents. Right? And those underlying beliefs coming from parents. So how can we help equip parents and friends a little bit better to respond to that conversation?
Are you all answering that, or are we just lifting up the various things that have come up? We're just lifting. We're lifting right now. Somebody's recording. Sarah's. Do I have a recorder? Okay. Lifting up. We're lifting up. We can't answer it all, but like it was no other conversations happening.
Just real briefly, what we talked about at our table, I know I already said something, but the thing that I was realizing too with this vocation talk is like there seems to be, we're mixing around a lot of different words with vocation at times. I feel like there's the universal call to holiness, there's our vocation for marriage, single life, and priesthood, and then there's like, what do I do, job, all this other stuff. Like I feel like these are multiple different vocations that require different responses. So I think that's helpful in our conversations with young adults to be able to like calm them down and to like help distinguish what they're called, like what they're trying to pray about. And then also this misconception that a lot of young adults have is that like God has this like magical answer in the sky and that they have to search for it. And that I preach so much with our young adults is like you have so much freedom in your choice, like of what you want to do with your life and what you feel, and that God's necessarily like this like good parent that just like listens to you and gives like pushes and suggestions. But at the end of the day, you're free to choose, and that you're not going to choose something wrong if it's holy and it's good. And so I think that's like huge with our young adults is like, it's okay. Like you trust yourself, be free and trust yourself.
Online. Online. No. We're not sure what's happening with the other mics, but that's okay.
The online group had a lot of conversation because a lot of the people online are diocesan directors, diocesan staff who are young adults. And so when the question was posed, a lot of them talked about what Sarah talked about, that the biggest thing that got them to continue and be supported in ministry was their parents understood that that was their calling in this particular point in life. The other thing that came up a lot was this question of, when it comes to discernment, how do we help young adults discern between two goods? We always talk about between like good and bad, but how do we discern between good and better? And so that was a big point of conversation from a lot of different people as well.
Good and better. Well, grammatically correct, it's always the better. Yes, ma'am. You're welcome.
I'm Vicki. I'm from the Diocese of Gary, Indiana. And Lauren? Yeah. All right. Lauren and I were chatting a little bit about vocation. And one of the things that we ended up talking about was a call to also a ministry of hospitality when we do events and when we meet people, and to make sure that young adults are seen. So once we encounter them, once we start building that relationship, to make sure that their journey and that their process is being seen, and that we can walk with them where they are at individually, and just be open to wherever they might be needing us to go with them.
All right, so there's a lot of movement around here, and I promised this young lady her final comment. I know you thought I forgot, because you all do actually need a break before we go into our next thing. So first, I want to thank you all for letting me just kind of switch things just a little bit, and I'll probably do it one more time, but
Hi, I'm Crystal from Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. And I guess my question maybe was kind of going off of what Beth was sharing is, I guess when walking with young adults, how to hold in tension, that call to like the singlehood, if like how I guess how to walk them through of not dwelling in despair if it's not the time that it's occurring for them yet, but like, yeah, it's tough. It's a tough how to discern that and how to walk with them, and not just closing the door. I don't know. I don't even know how to ask this question, but I'm attempting to. So.
Are you going to attack? Are you going to?
Sure,
Yes.
I can attack a couple. Well, I'm not going to attack.
I mean,
Can I address a couple of things that
I was working on saying that while I was processing something that Tracy had whispered.
Sure.
So sorry.
So to answer Crystal's question, I think there's this big myth, and it's what our colleague from Florida was saying before about the chasing the big V vocation, or how do we balance the discernment of the big V vocations between the small V vocations. And I always have said, life doesn't begin in marriage. Life is not a dress rehearsal for the day you make vows, whether that's vows to marriage or vows to religious life. Like, my life is happening now. And God meets us where we are, not in where we think we should be or where we're going to be 5 years or 25 years from now. I think helping young adults form skills for discernment that help them discern whatever their calling is. Father Michael was just sharing that he's in his first assignment as a Jesuit priest. And you know what? He's not in a parish. So, who am I to say that Father Michael didn't have like all these aspirations of imagining himself being ordained and then ministering to people in a parish, and that's not where he is. So, like, there's the big V vocation, and then there's the lived experience of here's what my job is, here's what my ministry is. But I think those skills, those discernment skills of prayer and listening, and the one that I wrote down, commitment and sacrifice, because all vocations invite us to at some point feel like we have enough information to make a decision and make a commitment. And often that commitment leads us to make sacrifices, because we make sacrifices for the people that we love. And that leads me to what I was saying earlier, is like looking for those signs of joy. So as a single woman, like, I've got lots of freedom. I've got lots of freedom of how to spend my time. And you know what? My best friend called me last night and she said, Beth, oh my gosh, we've got tickets to the Cubs game tomorrow night. And I'm like 4th down on my list of babysitters and everybody has said no. What are you doing tomorrow night? And you know what? Like, I'm a busy woman. I'm working. I had plans to go to the gym tonight. But you know what? I love my goddaughter and I love her brothers. And I always remind myself, as a single woman, in order to live into my vocation, sometimes it needs to be inconvenient, and I need to walk the walk of sacrificing for the people and things that I say are important to me. So I'm gonna babysit tonight. Because it's who I love. It's asking those questions of what have I committed to, what am I willing to sacrifice for, because I know that's God's call and it's where I'm invited to be today. It's not always about the big V vocation. It's where I'm invited into love and into relationship at this moment.
Last few remarks. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this goes to what Sarah said and what our online friend said. I'm in a class right now on pastoral ministry, and one of my friends in the class said something that I had never thought of before that really, really struck me. When someone discerns out of a vocation they thought they had discerned into, there's always a scarlet letter. They're labeled. If Father had not been ordained, he would have been former seminarian, former Jesuit novice, whatever. Why? Like, how ridiculous is that? And it goes to the point of being judged. When we think of the road to Emmaus, we think that Christ walked with the disciples to Emmaus, and Emmaus was not their final destination. So if we're going to walk with young people, young adults, who are discerning their vocation, if we're walking with them to the seminary or to formation for religious life, and it turns out that God's calling them to marriage or the single life, they are not former seminarian so-and-so or former this. They are Tom or Carrie or Beth or whoever. And that's something that we have to fight. And that plays into the stigma of vocation that Sarah was talking about. So if we're going to walk with people, we have to see them on the road to Emmaus. Emmaus was not the final destination. They returned to Jerusalem. Just because someone changes does not mean that they've gone in the wrong direction. That might be their Emmaus. And that change could be God leading them back to Jerusalem.
Preacher preaching. Preacher preaching. Mm-hmm.
Any final words? Mother? Are we good?
Thank you all so very much.